Well, happy Thursday, everyone. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I'm Katie, joined by Chris and John. This week, we are talking about Bing Webmaster Tools. This came about because after last week's episode of what to do when your SEO stops working, I said to Chris, should we be paying attention to Bing Webmaster Tools? Is that a search engine that we need to care about? So behind the scenes, we started to dig into, well, how much traffic does Bing bring us? What are the differences? You can see in our issue of our newsletter yesterday, if you want to subscribe, go to trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Chris actually explored a lot of the differences from a data perspective of Google Search Console and Big Webmaster Tools. In a nutshell, they kind of operate the same way, but because they're different search engines, different audiences, different intentions, you're going to get different results. So in today's episode, we're going to cover what is Bing Webmaster Tools, how is it different from Google Search Console, and what data to consider, what to look at. So Chris, where would you like to start today?
Let's start briefly by talking a bit about Bing itself. So Search Engine Journal does this roundup every year. And one of the things they noted is that Bing's market share is around 10% of searches. But the critical part is this sentence right here. Bing also partners with other search engines, Yahoo, AOL, DuckDuckGo, Ecosia, MSN, Lycos. The Bing API is used by Alexa for some... used by Alexa and other Amazon devices. Pretty much, if it's a search engine that is not run by Google, it's probably in some fashion fueled by Bing, either in part or in whole. So that's one of the reasons why we had to pay attention to it. In another related article, they calculated that something like 25% of searches are behind the scenes handled by Bing's data set. So optimizing for Bing search engine using their Webmaster Tools and their Webmaster guidelines is a good idea. That way we know that we're reaching not only more of an audience, but also potentially a different audience and possibly, depending on your efforts, a better audience. The other thing that makes Bing really different, well, a few things. One, they have APIs for just about everything, and they want you to use them. Right? Google has been notorious for decades now about concealing their data, concealing everything that goes on behind the scenes and stuff for good reason, because people try to game it. Bing outright says, hey, here's how we rank your content. And, they give you a bunch of the technical factors. Now, this is not, down to individual data sets, but they're pretty open and clear. Here's how we decide what's relevant. One of the interesting things that sets Bing apart from Google is they do a little bit more with exact match keywords. Google has switched fully to natural language processing. So Bing there's still some of the older school SEO. But interestingly, they take social media signals into account. They overtly say, we pay attention to stuff like things that are trending on Twitter and stuff because it's influential. You would be hard pressed to argue that major social networks are not influential, and they take that into account in their algorithm, where Google has said we don't count that as a ranking factor. It's not something that we may use it for indexing. Now, whether Google actually does not, we don't know, but Bing openly says that is the case. We do count this stuff. So given all that, it's probably a good idea at minimum for companies to have Bing Webmaster Tools set up and see what's happening behind the scenes. So
I think it's interesting because I think, so you're saying that Bing plus all of the other search engines it partners with is 25% market share, give or take. And so if you think about that in terms of the potential traffic, 25%, 25% of your potential traffic is not insignificant. Especially, we had done, and this is, a little bit off topic, we had done a calculation for one of our clients about how much potential revenue organic search traffic brings into their company. And this was an enterprise-sized company that 25% of their potential revenue would have been, at least a few $100,000. And so it's not something to just bypass completely, be like, oh, well, I have Google, that's good enough.
Exactly. Now, the nice thing is that Bing and Google do share the majority of ranking factors. For example, have good quality content, right, and get links to it. That's pretty common. So there's not a whole lot of, you're not going to create content just for one search engine and the other. For the most part, you're going to create the best content you can regardless. But they do, there are some differences, in the more technical side of things. Google has all of its core web vitals. Bing really looks at load times. They very much care about just how fast can you load your page, not so much like how much is it jumping around, or the cumulative layout shifts and things like that. That's not as important to them. It's just make your page as fast as possible. So maybe in another time or another show we can talk about different ways for doing that. Although we did cover that in the Cloudflare episode a few episodes back. So when you pop into Bing Webmaster Tools, you got to go through and register your site as usual, prove that you own it. And then you end up with an interface that looks pretty much like Google Search Console, except that there's a few more tools, a few different tools that you have here that you don't have in Google. So let's start with good old-fashioned search performance. One of the nice things that Bing has that Google does not do is they put your errors right inside the tool as well. So you can see like, hey, there's, the site, their crawler ran into some issues on your website. Please go take a look at it. And you can, we'll get to where that is located later, but you can also see your index pages, how busy was the crawler, and then of course your clicks and your impressions. Like Google, you can get your keywords and your pages to see what pages are getting impressions and clicks. And the metrics are pretty much the same. So impressions are the number of times that your site showed up in search, and then clicks are the number of times those listings got clicked in Bing. So that's what's in the search performance section.
John, have you ever, I'm putting you on the spot, but have you ever looked at which search engine traffic comes from for marketing over coffee?
No, actually, we haven't. I mean, I have in the past, but it's been years since I've looked at any of that stuff. I mean, this is always fascinating to me because most places I've ever been, Bing has been less than 10%. So it just gets left, ignored completely. So it's just interesting to see. Like, I didn't realize this interface has come this far. I mean, it's obvious. It's funny. It's a total Google knockoff, but it is interesting to be able to drill down and see this stuff.
It is. As with Google, you can look at a URL. It'll tell you if there's issues. Like one thing that it constantly highlights on our site is that we have multiple H1 tags on our homepage, which we do. It will also let you see your technical markup, your schema, to see what's in there. And it's always a good idea to look in there and see if there's anything that's glaringly wrong. Their Site Explorer lets you dig through your site and see individual pages and crawls. Your sitemaps, you can see how many sitemaps and how many pages it's discovered. Again, as with Google Search Console, if this number is not the number of actual pages you have, you probably have had something go horrendously wrong. One thing that's known about Bing that is different from Google is Google stops by and checks a lot more often than Bing does. Bing usually seems to stop by about once a day. Google can, depending on your site, can stop by like hourly.
Is that something that you can change in the settings, or is that something that's just completely out of your control? Like, I know that you can manually submit URLs and sitemaps, but in terms of the automated checks, can you change that cadence?
You can, and we'll actually get to that in the configuration section. There are ways to put some controls on that. Now, two things that are different than Google. One is Bing has an API called Index Now, where you can submit URLs. And you'll see there's a URL submission here. We can manually submit URLs, but if you have coding tools or SEO tools that can talk to it, Bing will actually take data from your website in a programmatic way and update its index. So on the Trust Insights website, we use a plugin in WordPress called Rank Math. And we have it configured that every time you hit the publish button, it proactively notifies Bing, hey, new page is up, to come take a look. And that is a very, very useful utility. Also, our caching software, Cloudflare, does the exact same thing. It looks, every time you clear the cache and reload it, it will send the snapshot of the URLs it knows about to Bing and say, hey, a bunch of new pages, come on over and take a look. You can submit up to, I believe it's 10,000 URLs per day. Now, obviously for a site our size, that's kind of silly. We wouldn't need that. But if you were, say, Amazon, you could use that up pretty quickly. So one of the things that Bing does recommend is that you have some kind of internal scheme for which of 10,000 URLs make the cut each day. So, for example, if you are Amazon, you might say, okay, well, what are our best selling products for today? Let's make sure those are in the top 10,000. That way they get indexed and crawled. That's the basic performance section. Now, this is where stuff gets fun. Bing offers SEO tools built right inside for it. Obviously, Google does not. Easy things like backlinks. Where are you getting links to your site? What pages are those links coming from? Was the anchor text on this? So you can see lots and lots of where links are coming from. I think I still win for links to the Trust Insights website. 6,500 links. Then you can see things like podcast players, press releases, Libsyn, which is where our podcast is hosted, Spin Sucks, Talkwalker. So lots and lots of stuff. And of course, one of the things to always do with these things is if you see something in here that you don't recognize, you should probably click on it and then see if there's an opportunity to do some additional link building.
Just eyeballing it, the nice thing is that it looks similar to the Google Search Console data, at least for what backlinks we're getting. So that's good news.
Exactly. Keyword research. It's one of those tools where Bing can start to suggest things for your website, but you can also do, let's do marketing analytics here. And it'll help you with some basic keyword data. So if you don't pay for an SEO tool, this is not bad. Now, these are Bing's results. They're not Google's results and stuff. And we do know the two indexes are very different in the composition, but it's not bad. It's not the worst thing. It's not the worst tool in the world. And for the low cost of $0, it's hard to complain about. So for coming up with ideas, you could put keywords in. It'll show you the rankings for that term. Again, pretty handy little tool.
Nice.
Let's go to SEO reports. So this is similar to the page experience panel in Google Search Console. This just tells you, hey, there's a bunch of issues on your website. Here's what they are. Multiple H1 tags, which it's interesting. Bing flags that as a high severity issue, whereas Google does not really look at that. Google says, I'll use that to understand the structure of your page, but that's about it. What our challenge here is if we would have to go back to our web designer and say, we need you to completely redo our theme, because that's
right, which we're not about to do.
Yeah, we're not about to fix that.
But the description being too long or too short is something that I've been working on, because that is the snippet that is shown as the preview for the page. So if you Google, what is Trust Insights, you should get a result that says, Trust Insights, and then a little description like Trust Insights is a marketing and management consulting, blah, blah, blah. And it should be enough information for you to be able to read and understand what we do, so that theoretically you're like, oh, yes, that is exactly what I'm looking for. Let me click on this link.
Exactly. One other thing that's interesting is that Bing does use the meta keywords field, whereas Google's ignored that for like a decade now. They don't use it necessarily as a ranking factor, but they do use it to determine page relevance. So the project that you've been doing of making sure that each page has an anchor keyword actually does still matter for Bing. So that is not a waste of time.
Good to know.
Yeah, and then just site scan stuff again. Is Bing picking up what it's supposed to be picking up? So that's what's in the SEO section. The configuration section, this is crawl control. This is where you can say, hey, this is when I want you to stop by my site, and this is when I want you to give me a break. So I have it set, for Eastern time. And then when do we get most of our traffic? Eastern time, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Now you could manually set this as well. If you were busy, if you were a European company, you would want to switch this. And maybe if you're a European company that also does business on the East Coast, you might have peaks and valleys for different times. But what this does is then during business hours, Bing will hit your site less, right? So it will, the crawler will not come as frequently. If you're a publisher like Digiday or the a Vice or whatever, you might want to have this set all the time. Like, swing by as much as possible, because you're publishing around the clock. So you might want to time this your publishing frequency as well. We might want to say maybe stop by. It's okay to stop by between 8 and 11 a.m. every day, because that's when new blog posts and and stuff go up on our site.
Now, I remember this is going back, good 10 or more years ago. Um, there was, an unsubstantiated rumor that your site being crawled by an SEO tool slows it down. I'm assuming that that is not true.
Well, it's like any other visitor to your website. Every visitor does enact a performance penalty of some kind. It's just not necessarily a lot. If you're using a modern MarTech stack, it should be a non-issue because a service like Akamai or Cloudflare or something would be able to serve up to those bots what they need without everyone else taking a performance hit. 15 years ago, yeah, if the web server is under some guy's desk at your office, then definitely the crawler is going to exact a penalty on it, and you're going to hear the hard drive thrashing under the desk. But these days, with everything being in the cloud, if you're on any kind of decent web host and you set up a CDN, it's a non-issue. Now, if you have not set up a CDN, you probably should.
All right, John. So it sounds like Chris is describing the hard drive under your desk that houses 15 years of Marketing Over Coffee episodes.
You would have no
churning
idea.
Away.
I have had the entire CRM system shut off when the secretary who had the computer under her desk, turn it off at the end of the day. So, yeah, that used to happen. Thank God for the cloud.
Exactly. Yeah, no, we actually did a revision of Marketing Over Coffee earlier this year. We moved it onto Cloudflare, put it onto CDN and all that stuff. So it finally got some love.
Well, that's good.
Exactly. Of course, you can tell Bing, hey, don't crawl these URLs as well, so that there are specific pages that you don't want that are not in your robots.txt file. You can block them here. The best practice, though, is put them in your robots.txt file, and that way everybody knows don't crawl those pages.
And just there's also a refresher, Chris, what is a robots.txt file?
I'm glad you asked. A robots.txt file is a configuration file that lives on your website that tells search engines either to look at a place or don't look at a place, or for certain robots to tell them to buzz off, right? So here you can see the Trust Insights one. We're saying any kind of browser, come on in, it's fine, right? Whereas if we wanted to specifically say exclude Googlebot, we could. If you had some, for example, if you had a section of your website, maybe you're a healthcare provider, and there's a section of your website where patients could log in, you would say, I want to deny all search crawlers. I don't want you to even try, don't even knock on the door. We don't want you here. Because behind that is a whole bunch of PHI. You would hope there'd be additional access controls, but that would be yet another layer where they'll say, yep, get out. In our case, we're like, that's fine, come on in. And then you can either have allow or disallow statements. So in this case, we're saying, hey, search engines, don't crawl our thank you pages. Yes, we have them, but we don't want you to crawl them. We don't want you to index them, because that kind of defeats the point of having a registration page if someone can find it right in search. And other things like our Matomo instance, which is our open source Google Analytics alternative. We're telling the search engines, don't bother crawling that either. There's nothing useful there. You can also, if you've got a whole bunch of unusual IP addresses in your web hosting logs, you can see if all that crawling was Bing or not. You just type in the IP address and it will tell you, yes, that was us, or no, that was not us. You also can see if if someone has filed a takedown notice for content on your site to Bing, you can see what that is and approve or disapprove it here. This is the same as like if you've posted a video on YouTube and YouTube flags it as a copyright issue. This would be kind of handling those disputes. By the way, to the independent musicians who have just used GarageBand music, you are competing with us in our videos too, because we're using GarageBand stock also. So we get copyright disputes every week with So What.
I was not aware of that.
Oh yeah, I get notices after every show, like saying, "Hey, it looks like you're using copyrighted music." Like, nope, and just after I file a dispute, and every week, 20 minutes later, like, okay, it's fine. You're all using the exact same snippets. Maybe someday we'll hire an independent musician to make our own theme music.
Someday.
Of course, you have your user management and Microsoft Clarity, which, if you're not familiar with, I believe we did a show on that last year. Clarity is Microsoft's free alternative to Hotjar and Crazy Egg and all those UI testing tools. and it was made part of Bing last year. But it is also I put that in a essentials tool. Like there's no reason not to use it. It's a terrific tool and does some really good stuff. So that's sort of the walkthrough of what's in Bing. Now we could probably spend, a whole bunch of time. I mean, we spent like 3 hours talking about this for the Google Search Console course. We could spend about that same amount of time on Bing. But what I do want to highlight is when you look at the results between Bing and Google, they are different. And as Katie said, you can see this in the Trust Insights newsletter from this week. We can talk a bit about them here. When I sort the spreadsheet by clicks from Google Search Console, these are sort of the list of terms. And what's interesting is that every term that's in the Google column is also in the Bing column. We may not be getting clicks from Bing on them, but Bing does know about them. If I do the reverse, and I search for Bing clicks, look at how many blank spots there are in Google, right? Now, some of these are things like, specific to fresh content. So what's interesting is that Bing seems to report back fresher content. So we put up our LGBTQ hate crimes data blog post this year. We put it up just before Pride Month every year. Google has no knowledge of those search terms when it comes to our site. So we're not showing up in Google for it, but we are, and we're actually getting clicks for it in Bing. And again, that's really, really fresh content. It goes to what is in Bing's Webmaster guidelines. They like fresh content. They like new stuff. But there's also other stuff in here that isn't in Google that we would perhaps like to be, like issues with predictive analytics, right? Maybe not pumpkin spice latte demographics, although I'm going to do that next month. But your newsletter open on the unaware audience, right? That is showing up in Bing. They actually got a click out of Bing. The 12 days of data stuff. So like I said, there's a whole bunch of stuff that Bing is sending us traffic for that, here, Trust Insight AI, YouTube for B2B, Trust Insights podcast. And that's someone looking for us very specifically on Bing. And so there's a lot of stuff in here that isn't showing up in Google. So either people don't type those queries into Google or we just don't rank for them. Because of the type of site Bing is, it has a different audience, different searches and stuff like that. And so there may be opportunities for us to get traffic from Bing that we may not be competitive for on Google. Right. So if we can't get it out of Google, maybe we can get it out of Bing, because a click is a click. Someone who wants to learn about Trust Insights, come on over. We'll take you any way we can get you.
So now what's interesting is with Google Search Console, you can tie it together with Google Analytics. So you can at least get some high-level demographic data, interest, things that they're interested in, those affinity audiences, that kind of stuff. You can't necessarily get that with Bing. Is that correct? Because then, it would almost make it too easy to be like, oh, this is what my audience looks like on Bing. This is what my audience looks like on Google.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I don't believe there is demographic data available about your website. You can get technographic data. So for example, here's Microsoft Clarity, right? And in Clarity, I can look and see like what kinds of browsers, what kinds of devices, what kinds of operating systems we're getting. That's interesting. Mac OS being substantially higher, Windows. But I can't get like ages or gender or anything like that. It's just, that data is just not available.
And you can't get interests.
That's correct. Can't get interest either.
Because those would be the things that I would be most interested in personally, of, what kinds of topics are people interested in that are coming to your site that you can get from Google Analytics at a high level. So you could say, and I think we did an episode on this, you could say like a lot of our audience is interested in cooking shows. So we should be writing about, tying in together how our data recipes are like cooking shows, so sort of like bring the two ideas together kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's not available here at all. I would say we still have to stick with Google on that. The other option would be is to sort of an X-ray, a publicly available audience, something like maybe Twitter, like our Twitter followers. things would be one potential avenue for doing that, which we did a show on that already. Another option would be potentially, I'm trying to think if you could do some other social media data. You could also do mailing list enrichment. So you can get some additional data if you were to upload the Trust Insights newsletter list to an appending service and get some data that way. That still is more technographic and firmographic than it is individual. But that would be an additional way to get some of that information.
It looks like services like Statista offer high-level audience overviews of the types of people who use Bing as a search engine. Like the thing that came up first was like majority of users of Bing are over the age of 35. So, that's helpful to know. I don't know what I'll do with that, but still helpful.
Well, it's one of those things that if you have a buyer in that segment, that would be a helpful thing to know if you're reaching more of that audience. If we're looking to do business with CMOs, statistically, CMOs tend to be older rather than younger staff. Not always, but that is the general trend. So it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to know about. The other thing that I think is useful, and we talked about this in the newsletter, is that Bing has a much greater efficiency ratio. So when I just do a quick sum on this column, there's 408 clicks to our website from Google, 179 from Bing. So that's a 2-to-1 difference. But then there are 325,000 impressions from Google and only 8,000 for Bing. So Bing sends fewer impressions, but the clicks to impressions ratio is much, much higher on Bing, which means that essentially when we show up in a Bing search, we're much more likely to get the click than when we show up in a Google search. So it is a more efficient search engine for getting us traffic. So if we want to spend some time maybe optimizing, taking a look at something like issues of predictive analytics. Right now we have that disadvantages of predictive analytics post. Maybe we need to write up an issues of predictive analytics blog post.
Again, it's the complementary to disadvantages. Issues is the original post from 2018. Disadvantages, I believe, is the complementary that I wrote earlier this year.
Okay, then we should freshen that one up because, again, we know Bing likes fresh content, so it's probably time to put that one on the content treadmill. But yeah, going through the keyword list quickly and just saying, okay, what's in here and what things should we freshen up. The same is true with pages, too. So if I search here in largest, smallest on Google, we see a whole bunch of stuff that, matches up with Bing pretty well. But then if I search for the same thing on Bing, there's actually a couple of blind spots. Like the LGBTQIA post here, that's missing from Google's index. The Instagram outage post is missing from Google's index entirely. So anywhere we see an NA, assuming it's not something that we don't want shared, how to research efficiently. That's an old So What episode. These are things that we need to go into Google Search Console and say, hey, what gives? Like you should have this page. You don't. Even if it's not sending any traffic, you should still have knowledge of this page. So it may indicate.
So we put that in manually.
Yeah, we would put that in manually. If the opposite were true, let's go ahead and just do a search here. Let's scroll down, see if we've got any. No, actually, I don't see any entries in the Bing list that are missing. That's kind of curious. If there were, we could submit them obviously to Bing, but it's kind of curious that there aren't any missing from Bing. Its coverage of our site is actually better.
Interesting. So I guess this comes down to, so we know, especially right now, marketers are stretched super thin. Like we're all doing a million jobs, wearing a million hats. We're trying to sell things. We're trying to, take care of our clients, do our marketing, all that sort of good stuff. So, what's the so what? Because it sounds like, if I take a step back, you've just added one more thing to my plate that I have to look at. So, how do I make this most efficient for me as the person who has to do something with this information? Where do I look? What do I pay attention to?
It depends on how much is wrong. right? So the bare bones minimum is in any of these tools, if there are things that are glaringly wrong, things that are throwing errors and they're fixable errors, fix them, right? That is sort of the table minimum. If you don't do that, I'd say you're missing out. So first order business, anything that Bing says, hey, this doesn't look right, and it's fixable, fix it. Like in our case, the multiple H1s, we're not going to fix that. We're just going to accept that that's the reality. Second thing is, it doesn't have to be every day or every week or whatever, but going through and looking at the results, the differences between keywords and pages in one search engine than the other. Maybe you do this quarterly, and you look through it and you say, okay, are we missing things in one or the other that are of value? And if we are, do we need to look at pages that mention those things and tune them up, refresh them, like the issues of predictive analytics? That's in 2018. That needs a revamp. I can guarantee. I mean, if it was written last week, technically it probably needs a revamp, but it definitely needs a revamp if it's over a year old. Anything about machine learning, data science, AI needs a second set of eyes and maybe a fresh coat of paint. And that would go into your content calendar, because we know that those pages are already getting traffic. We know that in some cases they're old and they need some tuning up. And because it's less work to tune something up than it is to create something net new. If I go in here and I look at these numbers, like that 2018 post, there's some 2019 posts in here. We need to change. We need to go and tune those up. We talk about summer slowdown. That's, or the winter slowdown. If you're in B2B, after Thanksgiving, your year's pretty much done, except for all the sales guys trying to close the year-end deals. But short of that, that's the time to take this list of pages and say, yeah, let's brush up what needs to be brushed up. Let's get rid of stuff that, if you've got pages in here that are getting 0 impressions, 0 clicks, yeah, it's time to retire them.
So would you remove pages from your site or archive them?
Archive and redirect them.
Archiving, interesting.
If they just get zeros across the board, that's the important part. Is if they're still delivering, traffic and impressions and stuff like that, that's fine. But if I search, goes all the way to the bottom here, and you got some stuff that is just on the zeros page, like this, Macon talk from Macon 20. I don't want to say that was the 2019 Macon. It's probably time to retire that one and then redirect that to someplace else. Other pages, like this one here, this is a new one. How to know if AI will take your job. It's just not really charting right now. That might be one to put in the newsletter again, or as we know from Bing and its social stuff, maybe reshare it on social and see if we can get any jump out of it. But based on what we know about how Bing works, it might be an opportunity to get some of these pages noticed again.
All right, John, your list just got pretty long. I hope you were taking notes.
Well, and I was wondering about the H1 tags too. That's kind of weird, but I do like in WordPress, H1 is considered a title, so you'd think there'd be only one, but in some ways it doesn't make sense. Like it's just another layout. There's no constriction on H2 through 5 or whatever. So
that's right. What's happening is that search engines in general look at H1s, H2s, they build what's called a document object model tree. And essentially that is like an outline, like it's an outline of a book or a table of contents. An H1 is like the title of the book, right? So you wouldn't have 5 book titles, right? You have one book title, then you have chapters below that, and then you have sections inside the chapters. And, that would be H3s and so on and so forth. When you have 5 titles on a page, everyone's like, so what is the title of this book, right? It's not, issues of predictive analytics, and then you have other stuff. That's how crawlers work when they're doing, when they're crawling your website. They're trying to build that model of what the page is about based on the logical order. And so what you'd want to do ideally is have that one H1, this is the title of this page, and the H2 is your big subheads, and the H3, H4, H5, and so on and so forth. If you do that in, like, for example, the Markdown language, some parsers will not even let you have more than one title tag. Like, no, you have to have a logical structure to this document. Fixing that it depends on how on what's going on with your theme, right? A lot of designers will just set different classes for like H1s and H2s to make them look a certain way on the site, not realizing that messes up how crawlers work.
So you basically just reinforce why teams should not work in silos, but really there should be more of a collaboration, regardless of the fact that it's the creative team versus the data team. Guess what? They still need to work together. So thank you, Chris, for reiterating that point.
Exactly. And, when we look at our website, it's our fault for not highlighting when we were commissioned our website design to say, hey, you're only allowed to have one H1 tag on a page. I don't care what you do with the style sheets, but it structurally has to look like this because, again, that's good information design. Your architecture should be different than your appearance, right? So function and form should be separate from each other so that you don't screw up the architecture trying to make it look a certain way.
Well, in a lot of companies, they do have an information architect versus a designer. We just happen to be a very small company who could not afford both.
Exactly.
Still born of a designer. That's where I'm at.
Oh, no. I like that design. It's okay.
Yeah, it's totally fine. But like I'm even looking at like my own personal site. I was looking at yesterday when I was trying to fix a broken plugin. And I'm like, wow, the theme that I'm using, I think it's probably time to move on. Noticing, more and more issues. One experiment that I'm running in the background is looking at how accessibility, ADA compliance, how our sites look at that. Trust Insights has like 35 violations of accessibility. My site's got like 300. But the theme I'm using is so bad for accessibility. Like, okay, it's time for this theme to go. If you're curious, by the way, we'll post the results. Probably for sure, certain we'll post them in the Analytics for Marketers Slack group if you want to see the results of whether accessibility has any correlation to search outcomes. But you should make your stuff accessible no matter what, because it's just a general best practice. But maybe that'll be in next week's newsletter too.
I was going to say that sounds like a future live stream, so stay tuned for that.
So that's it. That is the reason for Bing. It's one of those things that, extra traffic, and it might be more qualified traffic or certainly more efficient traffic. It doesn't cost you anything to sign up for Webmaster Tools. It doesn't cost you anything for Microsoft Clarity. It doesn't cost you anything except time to learn the interface. And there could be some goodies in there that, frankly, Google isn't surfacing. One of the things that we talked about, I want to say it was on a previous podcast episode, was Google's eating more and more and more clicks. Right? They're with the one box and with all this and snippets and featured text and stuff. They're getting better and better at returning useful information to the searcher that doesn't send them to your site. And so that's one of the reasons why that impressions number is so high, and yet the clicks number is so low, because someone could be searching for Katie Robert Trust Insights, right? And it'll display your bio from our site without sending the person to our site. So we have no idea. We don't get the traffic. We don't know what the impact of that is, whereas Bing will still probably just send them straight to our website. So if you're trying to measure search, make sure that you're taking Bing into account as well.
All right, John, what are you going to do tomorrow?
Get my Bing on.
And see.
And say, we'll talk to you all next week. Take care. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and our weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.